Wife cheated with her broke ex, demanded half of everything in our divorce. But she didn't know my mom secretly owned everything. All right, so here I am, writing this out because I honestly don't know what else to do. I never thought I'd be posting my business online, but things have hit a point where I kind of need an outside perspective. I'm 35, and I run a tech consulting business that's actually pretty successful, comfortable enough to not have to stress about the day to day. I built this thing from scratch over the last decade, and yeah, I'm proud of it. I've been married to Olivia, who's 33 for the last 2 years. We were together about 5 years total, and for the most part, I thought things were good. Turns out I might have been the only one who thought that. Olivia used to work in PR, but right after we got married, she decided she wanted to take a break and focus on us. That's what she called it. At first, I was totally fine with it. I mean, I figured we could afford it, and she'd jump back into the workforce eventually. I didn't mind supporting us both because I wanted her to feel comfortable. And honestly, the business was doing well enough that I wasn't sweating it. I thought it was a temporary thing, that she'd find her footing again. But looking back, maybe I should have seen the signs. The last few months, things between us started to change. I know that sounds cliche, but it's true. Olivia started acting distant, cold even, like she was checked out half the time. I'd get home from work, and instead of her usual warm greeting, it was like she barely noticed. She'd be out a lot more, always with some excuse about meeting friends or needing to clear her head. I figured maybe she was going through something, and I didn't want to push. You know, marriage has ups and downs, and everyone says you've got to ride those out. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously off. One night, she told me she was heading out with some friends and would be back late. It wasn't unusual by that point, so I didn't think much of it. I stayed up working on some stuff for the business, just trying to make progress on this new project we had going. By the time she came back, I was dead tired and already in bed. I barely heard her come in, and she went straight to the guest room. Now that had become her habit, crashing in the guest room whenever she got home late. She said it was so she wouldn't wake me up, but I started wondering if that was really all there was to it. Fast forward a couple of days later. Olivia was out again, supposedly with the same friends, and I was at home, just kind of waiting. I didn't want to admit to myself that I was waiting for her to get back so I could figure out what was going on. Around 11 p.m., I heard her laptop buzz from the kitchen counter. Apparently, she forget it there opened. Out of habit, I glanced at the screen. I know, maybe I shouldn't have, but it's not like I went looking for it. The name Ryan popped up. Now, Ryan wasn't a name I'd heard before. My heart kind of dropped when I saw the message. It read something like, "Can't wait until this is over. We'll finally be free." I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I had this gut feeling that something was really wrong. I opened the message thread. Yeah, maybe I shouldn't have, but at that point, my brain was just going nuts. And well, what I found was the stuff of nightmares. Turns out Ryan wasn't some random friend. He was Olivia's ex-boyfriend, the guy she dated before we even met. She used to call him a loser and complain about how he had no direction, no job, no ambition. So imagine my surprise when I'm reading all these texts between her and this guy, realizing they've been in touch for months, planning some sort of escape plan or whatever. And it wasn't just casual talk, they were serious. They had this whole fantasy planned out about leaving me, taking what they could and starting fresh together. I felt like my whole world just cracked open. I'd worked so hard to build this business, to make something that would set us up for life, and here she was, scheming to take it all. Ryan didn't have a job, didn't have anything going for him, and clearly, he'd found himself a golden ticket in Olivia's twisted plan. I kept reading, not knowing if I wanted to see more, but also feeling like I needed to know everything. The messages were disgusting, really. They'd talk about how they'd be set once Olivia got her half of everything in the divorce, and how Ryan could finally stop worrying about money because they'd be comfortable once she got her hands on my business. They were literally working out the details of how to squeeze every penny they could from me. It was like I was just some stepping stone in their big plan for an easy life. The worst part? Olivia made it sound like she was doing this all for him. She'd talk about how she was sacrificing her time with me to make sure they'd be financially set. Sacrificing. As if she'd been putting in effort or working by my side to build what we had. The reality is, she never contributed a thing. I mean, I've been the one working late, pulling in clients, dealing with the day-to-day stress. She was just there, living comfortably, but now she was painting herself as some kind of martyr. After reading everything, I just sat there staring at the phone, feeling completely numb. I had no idea what to do next. I didn't want to confront her right away because, honestly, I wasn't sure I'd be able to stay calm. And I knew if I came at her full of anger, she'd probably just deny it or twist things around. That's the kind of person she was, always able to spin a story to make herself look like the victim. But the thing that stuck with me the most wasn't just the betrayal. It was how calculated it all was. Like this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment fling. No, she and Ryan had a plan, and they were working me as part of that plan. The business, the house, the money I'd been putting away, they wanted it all. And here I was, busting my back to make a life for us, only to find out I was just their meal ticket. I stayed up the rest of the night, running through every single thing I'd missed. Every late night, every flimsy excuse, every time she'd brushed me off. It was like putting together a twisted puzzle that was there in front of me the whole time, but I'd been too stupid or too trusting to see it. By the time the sun came up, I knew one thing for sure. I had to confront her, but I had to do it smartly. There was no way I was letting her or that leech of an ex get their hands on what I'd worked for. After sitting with that gut punch all night, I felt like my head was on fire. There was no way I could ignore what I'd seen, and pretending everything was normal just wasn't an option. I needed answers, but more than that, I needed to confront her. I wasn't even sure how I'd keep my cool, but I had to try. By the time Olivia got home that night, I'd been pacing the living room for hours. She walked in looking completely unfazed, like it was just another night out. I called her over as casually as I could manage and said, "Olivia, we need to talk." She paused for a second, her face blank, and then slowly put her bag down. "Sure, what's up?" she said, a little too breezily, like she didn't have a care in the world. I could tell she hadn't picked up on my mood yet. It was all just business as usual for her, which made my stomach turn even more. I got right to the point. "Who's Ryan?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I thought I saw her face twitch just for a second before she shrugged it off, like she was hearing about some random guy. "What are you talking about? Ryan?" she said, putting on this clueless look. But I didn't say anything. I just held up her phone, which I'd left open to that message from him, the one about finally being free. Her face dropped, and this time she couldn't cover it up. She stood there for a minute, staring at her phone, before she finally looked back at me. "You went through my phone?" she snapped, like the only thing that mattered was that I'd invaded her privacy. I could tell she was panicking, but instead of apologizing or explaining, she just went straight to being defensive. "Yeah, I did. And you know what? I'm glad I did," I shot back. "Because now I know the truth. I know about you and Ryan, and I know what you're planning to do. So why don't you drop the act and tell me how long this has been going on?" She tried to dodge, but I kept pushing until she finally broke down, admitting that she'd been seeing Ryan for months. I expected her to at least look a little guilty, maybe apologize or something, but instead she looked almost relieved, like this was something she'd been wanting to get off her chest. "Yes, I've been seeing Ryan," she said bluntly, crossing her arms. "And yes, I'm done with this marriage. I want a divorce." I couldn't believe the nerve. No explanation, no apology, just straight up telling me she was ready to end things and move on with this guy who had nothing going for him. And she wasn't finished. She kept going, like she'd been rehearsing this in her head. "I deserve to be happy too, you know. You're always working, always more focused on that business than on me," she went on. "And yeah, I'm going to fight for my share. I put a lot into this marriage, and I deserve half of everything." There it was. Not even a hint of regret, just this sense of entitlement, like she thought walking away with half of my hard work was somehow her right. I knew I had to keep my cool, but inside I was boiling. "Half of everything?" I repeated, trying to keep a straight face. "You've barely lifted a finger for any of this, Olivia. I've been the one working late nights, stressing over clients, building this business from scratch. You've had every comfort, everything you wanted, without ever helping me out or supporting me." She just rolled her eyes. "That's not fair," she snapped. "I left my career to support you. I gave up things too." "Support me?" I said, laughing bitterly. "Olivia, you didn't give up anything for me. You wanted to quit working and I let you because I thought we were a team, but clearly I was wrong. You're just using that as an excuse so you can take half of what I've built." She narrowed her eyes and leaned in, trying to look intimidating. "I don't care what you think. I'm getting what's mine. And if you try to cheat me out of it, I'll make sure everyone knows the truth about you." Her confidence was sickening. She really thought she had this all figured out, like I'd just roll over and let her walk out with half of everything. But I wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. "You think you're going to walk away with half the business?" I asked. "You might want to think again." That finally made her hesitate. I could see her trying to process what I meant, her expression going from smug to slightly confused. "What do you mean?" she asked, a bit more carefully. "Exactly what I said," I replied. "You're not getting half of what you think you are. So go ahead, talk to your lawyer. Do whatever you need to do, but you're not getting your hands on the business. Her face turned red, and I could see she was rattled. I hadn't spelled out that the business wasn't in my name, but she could tell something was up. For the first time, her confidence seemed to slip a little. Fine, she said finally, crossing her arms. If that's how you want to play it, then that's what we'll do. But don't think for a second I'm going down without a fight. She grabbed her bag and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind her, leaving me sitting there alone. I couldn't help but feel this weird mixture of anger and relief. Angry that she'd been lying to me, scheming with her ex behind my back, and that she had the nerve to demand half of everything I'd worked for. But relieved too, because I finally knew the truth. I wasn't living in the dark anymore, playing the role of the clueless husband. I could finally see her for who she really was. Once she was gone, I stayed at the table, going over everything again in my head. All those little red flags I'd ignored over the past few months, they were all crystal clear now. The late nights out, the coldness, the secrecy, it was all part of her plan. She thought she'd hit the jackpot with me, that she'd ride off into the sunset with her ex on my dime. But she had no idea that she was about to hit a wall. After sitting there for a while, letting it all sink in, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. She thought she could just take half of my life, half of what I'd spent years building, but she had no clue what she was up against. If she wanted to fight, I was ready. She'd made her move, and now it was my turn. After finding out what Olivia was up to, I knew I had to keep my cool and think things through. She might have assumed I'd just roll over and hand over half of everything, but she didn't know the full picture. See, years ago, my mom had suggested that we put the business and other major assets in her name. She's a smart woman who's been in business herself, and this was her way of making sure that if anything went sideways in life, I'd be protected. At the time, it just seemed like solid planning. Now it felt like the smartest decision I'd ever made. For the next few days, I tried to keep things calm at home. I didn't want to give her any reason to suspect I had a plan, and I sure wasn't going to let her know what my mom and I had done. So I just went through my routine: work, come home, pretend like everything was normal. Meanwhile, Olivia was starting to show her true colors, going out of her way to act entitled like she was owed the world. Then I got a lawyer. I knew I needed someone sharp, someone who knew how to handle cases with messy financial situations. I met with him privately, showed him all the paperwork that linked the business back to my mom, and explained that I wanted to protect everything I'd worked for. He looked through it all and said, "Honestly, this is rock solid. If she thinks she's getting her hands on your business, she's in for a big surprise." Hearing that from him was a relief, but I knew it wasn't over. Olivia wasn't the type to give up without a fight. She'd already hired her own lawyer, some aggressive guy who was notorious for squeezing every penny possible. I didn't want a dragged-out court battle, but I also wasn't about to let her bleed me dry. I figured we'd try mediation first, to get it done quietly. The day of the first mediation session arrived, and I walked in feeling ready. Olivia was already there, looking way too confident, like she'd already won. She was sitting with her lawyer, whispering and giving me side glances, probably already running through what she thought she was going to get. I sat down with my lawyer, keeping my expression as neutral as possible, while he calmly laid out the basics of my financial situation. Right off the bat, Olivia's lawyer got right to it. He asked about the business, the assets, everything he could think of. I could see Olivia watching me like a hawk, looking smug, as if she'd already started spending the money. But as soon as my lawyer laid out the documents showing that the business was owned by my mom, their whole vibe changed. "Wait," her lawyer said, staring down at the papers in confusion. "So the business isn't actually in your name?" "Nope," I replied, keeping my tone casual. "The business is legally owned by my mom. It's been set up that way since the beginning." I saw Olivia's face fall a little, and her lawyer's confident expression was wiped right off his face. They clearly hadn't seen this coming. My lawyer flipped through more documents explaining the setup, the business, the assets. Everything substantial was legally tied to my mom. "You put everything in your mother's name?" Olivia finally blurted out, looking at me like I'd committed some kind of crime. "Yes, I did," I replied. "Years ago, it was a smart decision at the time, and honestly, it's proving to be even smarter now." Her lawyer was scrambling, trying to regain his footing. "Well, even if the business is in a trust with your mother, Mrs. Turner has rights in the marriage. She sacrificed her own career to support you, and she's entitled to her fair share." My lawyer looked at him and calmly countered, "Our client's holdings are entirely separate. Mrs. Turner is entitled to certain things, yes, but her claim on the business or any assets tied to it is non-existent." Olivia crossed her arms, looking angrier by the second. I deserve more than that, she snapped. I gave up my career for him. I was there for him while he worked, taking care of things at home. I want my fair share. I couldn't help but shake my head. Fair share? I said, keeping my voice steady. You haven't worked a day in the business. You haven't contributed a dime. The business and everything related to it? That's all mine. Or rather, it's in my mom's name. She didn't respond, just glared at me, and her lawyer looked more than a little uncomfortable. We went through the rest of the session, going over our finances in detail, and with each document, Olivia's anger just grew. I could see it in her face that this wasn't going the way she'd planned. Every asset she thought she was going to get her hands on was either in my mom's name or legally protected. Her lawyer tried to pick it apart, asking for more details, more documents, but there was nothing to find. At the end of the session, her lawyer was visibly frustrated, mumbling something about needing more time to review. They weren't going to give up easily, but I could tell they were starting to realize this wasn't going to be the cash grab they'd hoped for. My lawyer wrapped things up, letting them know we'd disclosed everything required by law and that they were free to go over it as thoroughly as they wanted. As I left the building, I could feel Olivia's eyes boring into the back of my head, like she thought she could still intimidate me somehow. She stormed off with her lawyer, not even looking at me, leaving me standing there with a strange mix of relief and anger. I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot, but seeing the look on her face when she realized she wasn't getting what she'd expected, that was a small victory in itself. When I got home, Olivia was there waiting, and I could tell right away that she was ready to unleash. She was pacing the living room, glaring at me the second I walked in. I barely had time to take my shoes off before she started in. "You've been hiding things from me this whole time," she shouted. "You put everything in your mom's name just so I wouldn't get anything. Admit it." I let out a sigh, trying to stay calm. "No, Olivia, that's not what this was about. It was just smart planning, plain and simple. You assumed you were entitled to more than what actually exists in my name." She wasn't having it. "You think you're so clever," she hissed. "But don't think I'm done. I'm going to get what I deserve one way or another." Without another word, she stormed off, slamming the door to the guest room, leaving me standing there in the silence. I couldn't believe the lengths she was willing to go to, all because she wasn't getting what she'd banked on. That night, I lay in bed thinking about everything she'd done. This wasn't the person I thought I'd married. The lies, the entitlement, the manipulation. It was like living with a stranger. I knew things were about to get uglier, that she wasn't about to back down without a fight. But at that moment, I felt something shift in me. This wasn't just a battle over money or assets anymore. This was about keeping what I'd built, protecting the life I'd worked for, and I wasn't going to let her take that away. After that mediation session, things got ugly fast. Olivia was furious, and she didn't even try to hide it. Every day after that was a battle. She'd throw accusations my way, accusing me of hiding things from her, of tricking her into thinking she'd get half of everything. But the truth was right in front of her face, and she just couldn't accept it. One night, I walked in after a long day, and Olivia was waiting for me in the living room. She had that look on her face again, the one that screamed, "You're not getting away with this." Before I could even put my keys down, she started. "Did you really think you could pull this off without me noticing?" She spat, arms crossed, eyes practically drilling holes through me. I looked at her calmly. "Olivia, I don't know what you're talking about. Everything's been laid out, and there's nothing hidden. It's all in my mom's name, and it's been that way for years." She scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, right. Sure. Just a convenient setup to screw me over, right? You had this planned from the beginning, didn't you? Just so you could walk away and leave me with nothing." I was getting tired of hearing this same rant every day, but I kept my voice steady. "Olivia, this has nothing to do with you. It was a smart financial decision, plain and simple. You're acting like I plotted all of this with some master plan to keep you out, but you weren't even in the picture when we set this up." She glared at me, her face turning red, and I could see her holding back whatever she really wanted to say. After a few moments, she just shook her head and muttered, "You'll pay for this. I'll make sure of it." From that point on, Olivia seemed to have a new mission: to ruin me in every way she could think of. I started getting calls from friends, family members, even some clients, saying they'd heard all kinds of crazy things from her. She'd been reaching out to everyone, telling them that I'd cheated her, that I'd been financially abusive, and that I was hiding assets so she'd walk away with nothing. One of my friends, Sam, called me one evening, sounding concerned. "Hey man, what's going on? Olivia's been posting some wild stuff on social media, talking about betrayal and lies. She didn't mention your name, but everyone knows who she's talking about." "It's complicated," I replied, feeling the weight of it all settle in. She's just mad things aren't working out the way she planned. She thought she'd be walking away with half my business, and now she's trying to make me look like the bad guy. Sam sighed. Just know people are talking, and some are taking her side. You might want to clear things up. I thanked him for the heads up, but inside I was fuming. Olivia had already done enough damage, and now she was taking it public, trying to smear my name just because she wasn't getting her way. It hurt, honestly, to see people believing her lies, but I couldn't stoop to her level. I just had to hope that the truth would come out in time. But Olivia wasn't satisfied with just spreading rumors. She decided to go even further, digging deeper to see if she could find anything that she could use to drag me down. A few days later, my lawyer called, letting me know that Olivia had filed for a full financial audit, convinced that I had hidden assets somewhere. She's really grasping at straws here, my lawyer chuckled. Let her dig. She's not going to find anything that isn't already on paper. While his confidence was reassuring, it didn't make dealing with her constant demands any easier. Every other day, it seemed like I was getting notices for more financial disclosures, requests for documents I'd already provided, and questions that went back years. It was like she thought that if she just kept pushing, I'd suddenly reveal some secret stash of cash she could claim. One night, I came home to a stack of legal papers sitting on the kitchen counter. More financial requests, more fishing. I called my lawyer, double-checking that we were complying with everything. He reassured me that we'd given them everything they needed and then some. It was just another tactic, another way to drain my energy and drag this thing out as long as possible. Meanwhile, Olivia's attitude at home was unbearable. Every conversation was a confrontation. Every look was loaded with anger and resentment. She'd barely speak to me except to accuse me of hiding things or demand explanations. She was acting like I'd wronged her in some unforgivable way, when all I'd done was protect what I'd built before she was ever in the picture. And just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I heard from mutual friends that Olivia was now spreading stories about how I was emotionally abusive, that I'd isolated her and kept her from living her life. She made herself sound like some kind of prisoner who'd been manipulated and controlled. It was a total lie. Olivia had always been independent, always doing her own thing, and half the time she was out with friends or family. I was never the controlling type, but that didn't seem to matter to her anymore. One afternoon, I ran into one of our old friends at the store, and I could tell right away he'd heard her side. He was polite but distant, like he didn't quite know what to think. I've been hearing some things, man, he said cautiously. Are you okay? I knew what he was getting at. I'm fine, I replied, keeping it brief. Just a lot of things being twisted around. Don't believe everything you hear. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't fully convinced. The damage was done. People had already started forming their opinions, and it seemed like Olivia was winning in the court of public opinion, at least with some people. It was exhausting, and honestly, it hurt. This was someone I'd once loved, someone I'd trusted, and now she was dragging my name through the mud just to try and take something she had no right to. As the days went on, Olivia only got more desperate. Word got around that she was asking her family and friends for money to keep up with her legal fees. She'd seriously underestimated how long and costly this was going to be, and now it was coming back to bite her. I almost felt a tiny bit of satisfaction, knowing her plans were falling apart. But then I'd remind myself how much damage she'd already done, and that feeling would fade real quick. Then came the latest round of demands, subpoenas for bank statements, asset lists, even documents from my mom. Olivia was pulling every string, trying to find something she could use to prove I was hiding money. My lawyer assured me that we'd covered everything, that my mom's assets were legally separate, but the fact that Olivia was dragging her into this mess made my blood boil. She had no right to go after my mom, no reason to think she'd find anything, but that didn't stop her. One night, as I sat alone in the quiet house, I thought about everything Olivia had done since this started. All the lies, the manipulation, the entitled demands. I realized that the woman I'd married was long gone, replaced by someone who didn't care about destroying my life if it meant she'd get what she wanted. I knew I had to stay focused, to keep pushing through this mess until it was over. Olivia might have thought she could break me, that I'd cave and hand over what she wanted just to get her to stop, but she was wrong. I wasn't about to let her take what I'd built, no matter how many lies she spread or how many demands she made. This wasn't over yet, and I was more determined than ever to see it through. After weeks of Olivia's schemes, accusations, and endless legal stunts, the day finally came when we were headed to court. I didn't know what tricks she'd try to pull, but I'd seen enough of her desperation to know she wasn't going down without making this as ugly as possible. I met with my lawyer the day before to make sure everything was locked in tight. He went through every piece of paperwork, from the business documents that tied everything to my mom, to personal finances and records proving I'd been transparent about it all. He reminded me to stay calm and stick to the facts, no matter what Olivia tried. The business, the assets, the savings, none of it was legally mine to give, and my lawyer assured me we were ready for anything. When I walked into the courtroom the next day, Olivia was already there, sitting with her lawyer. She wouldn't look at me, but I could see the fury written all over her face. It was like she'd built herself up to be some kind of hero, fighting against this terrible injustice. I knew she'd convinced herself she deserved half of everything, but today, she was about to get a serious reality check. As the proceedings began, her lawyer launched into a long-winded speech about Olivia's sacrifices. He painted her as the devoted wife who'd given up everything for me, only to be betrayed and left with nothing. He droned on about her support, her commitment to our marriage, and how it had supposedly allowed me to build a business. It was infuriating hearing him twist reality like that, but I kept my composure, knowing my turn was coming. When my lawyer took the floor, he cut straight to the heart of it. He presented all the documents showing that the business was legally owned by my mom and had been from day one. He laid out the financial structure, the trust setup, and even pulled out old emails that proved it was a protective measure unrelated to Olivia. Everything was rock solid. I glanced over at Olivia and saw her expression shift from smug to outright shock. She hadn't expected that. She really thought she was going to walk in here, cry a little, and convince the court that she was owed half of everything. But now, she was realizing that things weren't so simple. Her lawyer was visibly rattled, but tried to keep his ground. Even if the business is legally under your client's mother's name, Mrs. Turner contributed to the marriage and the lifestyle it provided, he argued, as if he could still salvage something. My lawyer responded calmly. Mrs. Turner is entitled to her fair share in the marriage, yes, but the business and all assets directly tied to it belong to the trust under Mr. Turner's mother's name. There's no legal claim Mrs. Turner can make on assets that were never Mr. Turner's to begin with. Olivia at this point was fuming. She shot me a glare like she was trying to burn a hole through my head. You think this is fair? That I get nothing after everything I did for you? She snapped. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice level. Olivia, everything was clear from the start. You knew I worked hard for this business, that I built it with my mom's support, not yours. You didn't contribute to it. You were never involved. She didn't respond, just glared, as her lawyer continued to push for any scrap he could get. We went back and forth, her lawyer trying to pry into anything he thought might yield more money. He demanded additional disclosures, requested financial records, anything to find some hidden fortune. But there was nothing to hide. After several hours of this, it was finally Olivia's turn to take the stand. She got up there and went off, talking about how she'd sacrificed her dreams to support me, how she'd put everything on hold so I could focus on my work. She painted this picture of herself as the long-suffering wife who'd put in as much as I had, and I could see her tearing up, trying to milk it for sympathy. I just sat there listening, letting her spin her story. When she finally finished, her lawyer sat back looking smug, probably thinking they'd scored some points. But I could tell the judge wasn't entirely convinced. My lawyer calmly got up, ready to lay out the truth. Mr. Turner, he began, can you tell the court more about the setup of your business, specifically why it's in your mother's name? I nodded. From the start, my mom and I agreed that placing the business in her name was the safest option. We did it for tax reasons and for security, in case of anything unforeseen. This arrangement was made years ago, long before Olivia was even part of my life. It wasn't to deceive anyone, it was just smart planning. My lawyer nodded. And did Olivia ever participate in this business, financially or otherwise? No, she didn't, I replied, keeping my tone steady. She wasn't involved in any of it. I built the business with my mom's help. Olivia didn't contribute a single dollar or any time to the company. Olivia's lawyer tried one last angle, claiming that even if she hadn't directly contributed, she had enabled me to focus on my work by managing our household. But that didn't hold much weight. We went through the evidence, showing how she'd voluntarily left her job, and how she'd lived comfortably off the income I brought in, without ever asking to be part of the business. After another break, the judge returned with his decision. I could see Olivia staring at him, her face tense, waiting for some glimmer of hope. But it didn't come. The judge ruled that Olivia had no legal claim to the business or any of the assets tied to it. Because everything was in my mom's name, it was separate property and beyond Olivia's reach. She was entitled to a modest settlement, but nowhere near what she'd been after. It was the outcome I'd hoped for, but seeing Olivia's face fall as the reality hit was something else. She looked like her entire world had just crumbled. When the verdict was read, Olivia's face turned pale. She glanced at her lawyer as if hoping he could do something, but there was nothing left to argue. She'd lost, plain and simple. As I left the courtroom, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was finally over. All the scheming, the accusations, the attempts to drag me down, it had all led to this, and she was walking away with almost nothing. She might still be furious, might still try to make me look like the villain, but I didn't care. I had my business, my future, and my peace of mind. Outside the courthouse, I felt the rush of freedom for the first time in months. The ordeal with Olivia had been exhausting, and the damage she tried to do wasn't something I'd forget easily. But seeing her realize that her plan to take everything had failed, that was worth it. I could finally move on, rebuild my life, and leave this whole mess in the past.